So last night, I started talking about our theme for the year. What we're focusing on this year is our capacity for resilience in a time of change. And it's important to know that whether we're going through changes in our personal lives, in our family, or changes in our community, we have at least 5 resources that make us stronger that we get from our Jewish tradition. These are our diversity, our creativity, our humility, our chutzpah, and our God-given ability to heal. And today, I'm going to talk about this gift of healing from the Jewish tradition, and specifically how we heal ourselves and our relationships with tshuva, that is making amends and returning to the right path, and mechilah, granting forgiveness. But first I want to tell a story that I heard from another rabbi of blessed memory, Rabbi Gerald Wolpe, who was retiring from a big synagogue on the East Coast. That's the coast on the other side of the country. And he told this story about another rabbi who was retiring. It's like Inception-level rabbi retirement. And when the rabbi was retiring, the president went up to him after the party and said, "What are you going to do now that you have all this time?" And the rabbi said, "Well, I think I'm going to finish my book." And the president said, "That's great, Rabbi. I didn't know you were writing a book." And he said, "No, reading one." Now, if you ever need a book to read, let me know, and I will introduce you to my friend Sam. Now, Sam has an apartment here in Pasadena, and inside you will find a bookshelf built into places you didn't know you could build a bookshelf, to hold his vast library covering every conceivable subject, fiction, nonfiction, Jewish, maybe not so Jewish books, the trivial as well as the profound. And among them, Sam says he has over 400 personal memoirs of people who, like Sam, survived the Shoah, the greatest crime of the Holocaust. Many of these memoirs exist simply because of labors of love. They were published by family members. They were published by foundations. Many are so rare you can't find them on Amazon. Now, that's a rare book these days. But they're precious not just because they're rare, but because they tell the personal stories of a rapidly vanishing generation of survivors, the testimony of whom the conscience of humanity cannot bear to lose. And may God judge us severely if we ever forget what these survivors bore witness to. Now, the first time I visited Sam, he lent me a book. It was called Save My Children by a man named Leon Kleiner, who had been a childhood friend of Sam, and Sam's in the book. Now, I love books, almost promiscuously so, but I identify not only with the retiring rabbi who finally got to finish a book, but also what that rabbi's son, Rabbi David Wolpe, once said, "Acquiring more books than one can possibly read is how the soul reaches for infinity." Nevertheless, a few weeks after Sam lent me the book, he cornered me at Kiddush. "Have I read the book yet?" "I should hurry up," he said, because he wanted to discuss it with me and lend me another one. Now, I'm going to guess I have about 180 pounds on Sam. I'm not bragging about that, by the way. But I was beginning to feel a little bit intimidated. So the following week, I sat down and I read it cover to cover in one sitting, and God bless Sam, because in this rare volume, I found what's perhaps the most powerful story I've ever read about turning your life around and how the ability to heal your own wounds and to help other people heal can be the ultimate source of resilience in times of adversity and change. And this book took place largely in the city of Tulusta, which is currently in the Ukraine. I think then it was in Poland. It kind of goes back and forth. It's famous in some circles as being the birthplace of the Baal Shem Tov, sort of great-great-grandfather of the modern Hasidic movement. But there was, and Baal Shem Tov means the master of the good name. But in Tulusta, there was another man, a man named Timush. And you might call him a Baal Shem Ra. He was a master of a bad name, a bad reputation, because all the Jews in Tulust knew Timush. He was a Ukrainian by nationality, and he was a violent man of violent temper, and one of his hobbies was picking on Jewish people in the town. And because of the way the world was then, he could get away with it. Now, at one point or another, some of his violent tendencies he didn't get away with, and he was sent to prison. And he was sent to prison probably for the rest of his life, and perhaps not a long one. Now, in this cell, he couldn't see out the window. It was high up on the shelf, but he could hear somebody talking to him. And there was a little hole in the wall. And he started a conversation, and he learned that the guy next to him was a Russian Orthodox priest who had been imprisoned for speaking out against the violence and deprivation that prevailed. And he talked to this priest about his life, and the priest encouraged him, brother, you got to make tshuva for all that. Probably Russian Orthodox don't use the word tshuva, but he said, you've got to make amends, you've got to confess, and you've got to change your ways. And Timush was inspired. He poured out his whole heart to this priest, and he told him all the terrible things that he'd done. And knowing that this might be the last person who ever talks to him kindly, he said to the priest, I'm going to change my ways, God willing I ever get out of here. Maybe not knowing he would get to cash that in. But then one day, a bomb strikes the prison and tears the walls down, and all the guards are scattered, and he sees daylight. And he escapes the prison, and he returns back to his town. And he sees what's happened in the Nazi occupation of Tulusta. And he knows that Jewish people can't go to work, they can't operate their businesses, they can't own money, and so they can't buy what little food they are allowed to buy. And so he starts to go to all the different Jewish households and says, what do you need? And to Leon's family, he brings bags of flour and sacks of potatoes at a time when they're lucky to get a crust of bread in a couple of days. And he keeps this family alive. And at first they didn't trust him because they knew this guy. They said, what do you mean you're asking me these questions? Are you here to turn me in? But after talking to them, after asking them about themselves, after gaining empathy and earning trust, they began to count on him, this man who had turned his life around. And even when Leon's parents were carried away to prison and ultimately to death, Timush was present when he heard Leon's mother call out, save my children. And so what he does is he rents a house on the outskirts of town, and he devises this ingenious plan where he goes down to the cellar, down to the basement, and he digs out a sub-basement, not right underneath, but kind of off to the side. And you got to see the diagram. Ask Sam for the book. But he digs out this ingenious place where he is able to hide Leon, his brother, his sister's boyfriend, and their aunt. And for 5 years, they live in this tiny little cellar because this man had made tshuva, and he saved their lives. While they were in the cellar, Timush was drafted into the army and taken away. Later on, they hear that the war has ended. They come out of their cellar, and they say, what happened to Timush? And his wife said, I don't know. Later, they found out what happened to him. He died in the war. They never got to see him again. This is what happens when somebody has that moment and they turn around and they say, I reject the way I was. This is the power of this season. Now, a couple of years ago, I had the privilege of learning with a teacher named Abby Pfeiffer Mandel. She's a professor at USC in the Marshall School of Business. And she leads their social enterprise lab. And occasionally she runs this fellowship for rabbis, which teaches us the different modes and resources from the cutting edge of the business world to help help us better serve our communities. And we were taking a class, a bunch of rabbis together with this wonderful teacher, and it happened to be around this time of year. And she said, you know, from my observations, not just in the Jewish world, but in the business world and the world at large, I can tell you there are two phrases that Americans in general seem to have real trouble with these days. The first phrase that we stink at is, I'm sorry. The second one is, I forgive you. Instead, we tend to demand apologies from others in our culture, while demanding that others indulge us in living our lives unapologetically. I might tag an Instagram of a selfie of myself at a bookstore, hashtag sorry, not sorry. But beyond harmless indulgences, we take that same selfish attitude, sorry, not sorry, into the marketplace, into the boardroom, into the bedroom, into the public square, and into the private voting booth. We say, I'm right, you stink, you and the horse you rode in on, and how dare you? And if we can tweet it with impunity, especially with online anonymity, the new white hood, why shouldn't we? After all, it's just words, right? Because these words are tearing us apart. It's tearing apart our communities, it's tearing apart our families, and it's tearing apart our very souls. But there is a better way. There's a way to heal, to mend, and to grow. The Jewish tradition, to coin a phrase, has an app for that. Thank you. And there's a couple of guys, Joy Ito and Jeff Howe, who were running the MIT Media Lab. They wrote a book called Whiplash, How to Survive a Faster Future, a book I have almost finished. And they write about how there are new skills and resources that are superseding obsolete ones when it comes to adapting and thriving in a rapidly changing world. Ito and Howe explain how today compasses can serve us better than maps. How taking risks, it turns out, makes us more safe than idolizing safety. And how we once valued strength in our institutions, today, resilience is the new strength. This last point, they illustrate getting into the complex world of computer viruses and computer security and network security and things like that. They talk about how these viruses and malicious software are being created and distributed faster than any one person or group can anticipate them and handle them, at a time when we depend more and more on this kind of security for all sorts of transactions speeding around the globe. Ito and Howe observe that just as we use the language of biology to discuss these threats, viruses, infections, mutations, and so on, the source of our resilience against them can model a biological paradigm as well, that of the immune system. And how do immune systems work? By failing, and then healing, and failing again, and healing again. As Samuel Beckett said, ever tried, ever failed. No matter, try again, fail better. On the spiritual plane, these failures go by the name of sin, a word you're probably reading and hearing a lot about today. But each sin that we talk about in our prayers of confession today is ultimately itself a breakdown of a relationship that you have with another person, a relationship with yourself and how you see yourself and judge yourself, and a relationship you have with God, whether you are on speaking terms right now or not. But each failure, each error, intentional or unintentional, impairs that relationship, and every cut that goes unmended serves to unravel and disintegrate the fabric of our communities, the fabric of our families, and of our own sense of self-worth, But just as your body, once ill, develops antibodies to better cope with similar situations in the future, by having the courage to handle these threats to our relationships, even imperfectly, but persistently. We learn what we need to know to better safeguard our relationships in the future, our relationships with each other, with ourselves, and with God. Even as we celebrate the birthday of the world, we learned that amends and forgiveness, teshuva and mechila, the Jewish immune system, was created before the physical world, according to Masechet Pesachim in the Talmud. And this is indeed because how could the world survive without it? And if you're curious, here's how to do it. Maimonides spells it out for us. To repair what we need to repair, first, we have to recognize the threat. We have to know what we're doing is wrong. We have to take responsibility for it. We have to remodel our habits and our environments so that we don't repeat the failure. We have to speak the failure out loud. It can't be, I'm sorry you feel that way, but I'm sorry I did that thing to you. We have to seek to make up for it. Ask forgiveness. And if that fails, according to the Rambam, we try again. We try in public. If we fail better. If we fail 3 times, Maimonides says, you've done all you can do, and the failure at this point is in the hands of the one who failed to forgive. Now, while Judaism places a premium on the quality of being a forgiving person, we don't encourage or accept what Dietrich Bonhoeffer calls cheap grace. We are not obligated to forgive people who don't ask for it. We're not obligated to forgive people who haven't changed their ways so that we can trust that they won't hurt us in the future. We are not obligated to that, but we're allowed. We're encouraged to be generous with our forgiveness, not for the sake of the one that we forgive, although doing so teaches that tshuva is valid, effective, and accepted. We become a shaliach mitzvah. We become an agent of their improvement. But we don't have to do it for their sake, but for ours, the kind of character and the kind of disposition we seek to build for ourselves as we walk in the world. Forgiving those who hurt us doesn't make us weak. It doesn't make us friarim. It doesn't make us suckers. It makes us better. Not better than those we forgive, although sometimes we might feel that small joy. But more importantly, better than we were ourselves yesterday, and walking taller than we did when we were bearing the weight of the grudges that we carried. In Pirkei Avot, it talks about the temperaments of humanity, and it says that one who is quick to anger and slow to forgive, perhaps someone with a short fuse and a long memory, guilty. This is the mark of a rasha, a wicked person. Or on Twitter, it's just called a day that ends in the letter Y. But being slow to anger and quick to forgive is the mark of a chassid, is the mark of the pious, is a mark of the righteous. The rabbis in the Talmud are once having a debate, big surprise, they were having a debate about whether God prays. Right? Who would God pray to? They said, of course God prays. Does God wear tefillin? Of course God wears tefillin. Why wouldn't she? It's the tefillin of God that Moses sees when Moses wants to see God, and God says, you can't see me and live. But I tell you what, hide in that cave, and as I'm walking by, you can see behind me. And the rabbis think that Moses looked and saw the knot on the back of God's tefillin. So, of course, this starts another argument. What's written in God's tefillin? Effectively, what is God's prayer? And they say that every day God prays, May it be my will that my mercy outpace my wrath. It says that when we err, when we sin, when we make mistakes, intentional or unintentional, those can have consequences for 3 or 4 generations. But then when God forgives, God takes care of you for 1,000 generations. And we too can pray, may my mercy outweigh my wrath. I have to say, if you're anxious about change, changes in your community, changes in your country, changes in your health, changes in how you see yourself as you grow, I wish I could tell you that I know it's going to be okay. I wish I could dismiss your anxiety as trivial, but I don't have that right, and I don't have that knowledge. But I can tell you that the best way to face the future is together. And the best way to make sure we stay together is by taking advantage of this holy season. We are called to employ the technologies of our tradition, the gifts of tshuva and mechila, the gifts of I'm sorry and I forgive you, custom made to the measure of our hearts, both in our hearts' limitations and in our hearts' longing for one another, because that is how we face the future with resilience, with courage, with faith, and with hope. I bless all of you with this kind of courage in the year to come. Shana Tova.